I'm glad to be participating in this Gospel Life rally. John Ensor, for years, has been one of my heroes. I don't think anyone would confuse his looks with those of Hollywood legend Steve McQueen, but he and some other pro-life heroes do remind me of McQueen in The Great Escape. It's a movie from 1963. He plays Captain Virgil Hiltz, an American pilot stuck in a prisoner of war camp in World War II Germany. McQueen has a terrific motorcycle chase. Near the end, he almost gets away. Captain Hiltz spends so much time in the prison camp jail, the Cooler, that he becomes known as the Cooler King. Well, all of us in the pro-life movement are also Cooler Kings. We pro-lifers have been in a prisoner of war camp ever since 1973. That's when, as you know, the Supreme Court majority overrode state laws, legalized abortion throughout the United States. Since then, the Supremes have killed almost every attempt by state legislatures to tear down the prison walls and the fences. Once in a while, the court has allowed the removal of a watchtower. States have been able to create small protections that have benefited some unborn children, but not anything that would take a big bite out of abortion. In the Great Escape movie, the Allied prisoners of war try to escape the German POW camp. The prisoners work on 3 tunnels simultaneously, calling them Tom, Dick, and Harry. The guards discover Tom, the tunnel furthest along. Then the prisoners intensify their alternative efforts. The pro-life movement has dug 3 major tunnels. We can call the first, say, Tunnel A. Some work on appointing good judges, passing laws by electing pro-life presidents and legislators. Others, not so more recently, have worked on Tunnel B, direct action, including blockading abortion centers. And the third tunnel is Tunnel C, directly helping women and men before, during, and after crisis pregnancies. Each of those 3 tunnels has had faithful diggers. I've tried to discern, as an historian, which tunnels are partly blocked, which offer, from historical evidence, the greatest hope of saving the most lives. So here's my plan for the next 45 minutes. I'll talk briefly about Tunnel A, somewhat more about Tunnel B, and then I'll take a longer look at Tunnel C, the Compassion Tunnel. I'll give some specific examples of what worked. Then I'll apply this historical analysis to our present situation. I'll talk with you about how we can help young men and women before they have a crisis pregnancy, while they have it, and after they have it. First, the tunnels, then, starting with Tunnel A, trying to appoint good justices, since these days we are so judge-dependent. And that means, in most states, electing people who will make good appointments. It means crafting legislation in cases. I have friends who have spent their lives on this. I support those efforts. Maybe they'll come to fruition. We may have a breakthrough in Texas with our new heartbeat law. The courts, miraculously enough, so far, when I'm speaking here, have not struck it down. Or we may have a breakthrough at the Supreme Court. It will rule next spring on the 15-week protective law passed in Mississippi. Laws are important. They do have an effect. Even bills that don't make it into laws can be tremendously educational. But we've learned not to expect much. There's a Texas story about a farm girl milking the family cow. A stranger approaches. He asks to see the girl's mother. "Mama," the young lady calls out, "a man is here to see you." The mom looks out the kitchen window and replies, "Haven't I always told you not to talk to strangers?" And the girl says, "But Mama, this man says he's a Texas state senator." And the wise mother replies, "In that case, come in right now and bring the cow with you." Well, I hope and pray the Texas and Mississippi laws will be upheld. I'm not counting on it. If they are upheld through God's mercy, then states like New York, California, Illinois will crank out even more abortions. States with protective legislation will have problems in enforcement. More women will get baby-killing pills by mail. Telemed appointments will be more common. Will juries convict abortionists? History tells us that the judicial and legislative tunnel is worth digging, but we can and should expect lots of cave-ins. Tunnel B is the direct action tunnel. Blockading abortion businesses was a major part of the pro-life movement 30 years ago. Operation Rescue was at its peak. Demonstrators did close down some abortion centers for a day. On that day, those lives were saved. The long-term effect, though, was not positive. It was worth a try. Big media had supported civil rights sit-ins and demonstrations during the 1960s, but journalists in the 1980s and the 1990s unfairly characterized Operation Rescue efforts, all those efforts, all the pro-lifers, as bullies. A lot of public opinion turned against the pro-life movement. Now, I'm tempted to say, who cares about public opinion? Lives are at stake. And that's true, but as an historian, I've seen the truth of Abraham Lincoln's statement. Public sentiment is everything. With public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. Our abortion totals were the worst ever during the 1980s and the early 1990s. But if you add up the numbers, the most terrible 4 years were 1988, 1989, 1990, and 1991. Those were also the prime 4 years for Operation Rescue. So, 2 productive kinds of direct action and 1 terrible one I can mention. Again, Operation Rescue, good try, didn't work in the long term. But a couple of good kinds here: exposing abortionists, showing, for example, how Planned Parenthood sells baby parts. That's very beneficial, that exposure. And then a second good kind, praying in front of abortion businesses. For example, folks connected with 40 Days for Life, they've prayed outside abortion centers in more than 500 cities. The participants agreed to pursue only peaceful solutions to the violence of abortion when volunteering with the campaign. They pledged to show compassion and reflect Christ's life to all abortion clinic employees, volunteers, and customers. Now, as a journalist, I'm skeptical about numbers. 40 Days for Life says its campaign last fall, which ran from September 23rd through November 1st, led to heart changes that saved 757 children, an average of 19 per day. Maybe so, maybe it's 15, maybe it's 20. I don't know that, but I do know this. The Bible tells us to pray, and peaceful prayer in front of an abortion business does not lose any lives. An organization blocking the doors of abortion centers might keep more than 19 people having an abortion that day. But what about the next day or the next week? What about the negative stories from hostile reporters that drive public opinion toward greater support of abortion? Win some, lose more? That's the problem. But here are 2 stories. Here's a story of 2 lives saved in spring of 2020. A young mother arrived at the Bridgeport, Connecticut Planned Parenthood facility. She watched people praying for her outside the building. She still went in. The abortionist performed the required ultrasound, which showed the woman carrying twins. But thinking about those praying, she just could not go through with the abortion. She got off the table. She left. And she came back at the fall 2020 vigil to show pictures of her little girls. So that's a very good kind of direct action. The terrible kind of direct action is shooting abortionists. You don't fight murder by murdering. It turns bad men into martyrs. It turns the label pro-life into a joke and a sneer. And besides, some of the most effective pro-life people are ex-abortionists. Bernie Nathanson, for example, was an abortionist who presided over the deaths of many, and then he put out that film Silent Scream. That was very effective during the 1980s and 1990s. So, thou shalt not murder. Enough said on that. Let's turn to Tunnel C, compassion for those undergoing crisis pregnancies and their endangered children. Compassionate pro-lifers for 2 centuries have faced 3 questions. First, how to cut down on the number of crisis pregnancies. Second, when pregnancies occur, how to help. And then third, when an abortion occurs, how to help a grieving mother and reduce the possibility of her having another abortion. I want to take you back to the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Abortion did not start with the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. Starting in the 1830s, as Americans moved from farms and small towns to cities, the number of abortions grew. Prostitutes had many abortions. So did seduced and abandoned single women. So did some married women who became part of a 19th century New Age spiritualist free love movement. Now, to help explain this quickly, I've created some composites of people in their 20s moving a century or more ago from a farm or small town to New York, Chicago, San Francisco, or other large cities. I'll call the young woman in my composite Susan. I'll pick a typical American name for the young man, Marvin. So Susan first. She's moving to a big city to become a shop girl or a stenographer. She steps off the train. She receives a courteous greeting from a well-dressed man. He asks if she needs help to find a job or a place to live. He's actually a sex trafficker. She's confused, she's nervous, she's about to accept his offer of help. Then a matron from the Travelers Aid Committee steps in. That older woman explains what the man really wants. She offers Susan a clean and safe room. The next day, Susan goes out and she rents a bed in a rooming house that's recommended as a safe place. She scrutinizes help-wanted newspaper ads. She plans to head out the next morning to visit potential employers, but that evening, in her rooming house, several young women are meeting with a volunteer from the Girls Protective League, as it was called. The volunteer notes the importance of spurning improper proposals when applying for positions through newspapers and employment agencies. The volunteer shows Susan a blacklist of dangerous places, and it includes an address of one of the places Susan was planning to visit for a job. So with that help, with help from people in the community, almost always Christian, she navigates early difficulties. She gets a low-paying entry-level job, and there's the initial buzz. She's making it on her own. Then boredom sets in, temptation grows. A friend makes good money for massage parlor work. She makes big bucks if she offers sex. Another friend of Susan's goes out on the evening with a gentleman caller. He takes her to restaurants and theaters. He pushes for sex in return. If she gets pregnant, he says he'll pay for an abortion. Maybe even says, no, you don't have to get an abortion, I'll marry you. But he won't. So the churches and charities at that time knew that young women don't live by bread alone. They made a point of offering entertainment alternatives. They chaperoned activities where young men and women could meet in living rooms rather than bedrooms. Susan was likely to find a legitimate suitor and get married, maybe even someone named Marvin, unless Marvin had gotten used to the brothels and the cheap music halls. He was even more likely to become dissipated and debauched unless someone offered alternatives. Now, YMCAs these days are known as places to play basketball. They started out in the mid-19th century as much more. Christians founded and funded them. The Boston YMCA gave details of its goal. Meet the young stranger as he enters our city. Direct him to a boarding house where he might find a quiet home pervaded by Christian influences. Introduce him to a church. Throw around him good influences. And then help him find a good job. Show him how to be involved in charitable work to help the sick and the destitute. Offer lectures and healthy entertainment. YMCA set up libraries and reading rooms that were special at that point because in those days, most of the libraries and reading rooms were private. They were for the rich. Very few cities had public libraries. The first employees most YMCAs hired were librarians. The librarians were to care about the books, but also care about people. They were to, quoting from one job description, call upon young men in stores and offices and shops, introduce them into some church connection. Every evening spent in a library where talking and social intercourse were allowed was one fewer evening spent in hustling for sexual intercourse. Sex outside marriage was trouble in itself. It also led to attempts to eradicate its sometimes consequences. But what happened when attempts to prevent or make more unlikely unmarried pregnancies, what happened when those attempts failed? That's why the late 19th century saw an enormous expansion of centers for the pregnant and unmarried. Example, Chicago had the Florence Crittenden Anchorage Mission, the Life and Hope Mission, the Salvation Army Rescue Home number 568, the Rescue Mission, the Bueller House, the Jewish Home for Girls, and many more. These organizations were usually realistic. The women who entered them and the men who had contributed to their problems had sinned. Nevertheless, the Bible teaches that all sin and fall short of the glory of God. The Illinois Medical Journal declared in 1904 that the woman who, in conscious knowledge of the obstacles before her, calmly faces the world with her illegitimate child is a heroine. Her path is beset by daily perils and pitfalls that demand all the resources of her intellect and courage. Years ago, I spent an afternoon in the Chicago Historical Society learning about one group. And I still remember as the sun went down, I was paging through 20 years of records from the Erring Women's Refuge. Let me spell that out for you. Erring, E-R-R-I-N-G. No euphemisms in those days. The goal at the Erring Women's Refuge was to offer the Susans of the city physical and spiritual help and to make sure their babies survived. One young woman later wrote that the refuge was the first place I ever lived that any person cared enough about the salvation of my soul to make it a matter of interest to me. Another woman wrote, the beauty and joy of living with Christ, Jesus can and does save even me. Those 20 years of record showed many of the women placing their children for adoption. Others became single parents and gained help in finding jobs as clerks or seamstresses and finding childcare. Others got married. A woman often stayed at the refuge for a year after her child was born, so she had time to figure out what came next. I read in the New York Public Library records about the Heartsease home in New York City a century ago. The director, Annie Richardson Kennedy, wrote of a young Susan who joined a touring vaudeville act. She slept around, she became pregnant. I'm quoting here, when her employer discovered her condition, she was practically abandoned in New York and was sent to us from a hospital. When she came to the door, she was literally without funds, clothing. She was all alone. We've since written her mother, and she will care for the girl and her baby. They are very poor but respectable people. The girl has been led to see the folly of her way. Annie Kennedy described a Susan who loved a Marvin. He ruined and left her. She came to our home through a member of church. She did not know what it meant to be born again. She knows now. The girl had become a mother. That was when she wrote home to an old, heartbroken aunt and uncle whom she had lived with since a baby. I am glad this trouble has come upon me. It has saved me from worse things. God has led me here where I've been taught the way of life. I know now that my Savior forgives and saves. And by the way, 30 years ago, I visited the site of the Heartsease home, 413 East 51st Street in Manhattan, and the building was occupied by the Consulate of Yemen. I went through the files of a Boston charitable society around 1900. Typical story, a young man promises a young woman that he loves her. They become intimate. He promises to marry her if she becomes pregnant. When she does, he deserts her. Happened all the time. Here's one more. A teenage orphan wants a mother's love, but she can't get it. She develops an awful longing for someone to love me. She meets a young man who represents herself as her dearest friend. They have sex, she becomes pregnant, he disappears. That's the bad news. The good news is that she and many of these women learned about Christ and a love that would not let them go. Now, these charitable groups had hard times. Heartsease was not a government institution that could survive on money from Washington, which would then print more. Contributions to Heartsease came on a just-in-time basis. And Annie Kennedy wrote, Heartsease always seemed on the brink of insolvency. But then one of our good friends sent us vegetables during last summer in such a quantity that we were able to can enough for our winter supply. We were in need of kitchen utensils. A friend sent in a box of odds and ends. And when Heartsease needed cribs, a wealthy woman whose daughter recently died told Annie Kennedy, today is Betty's birthday. So she offered the crib for your babies. This is what she said she would have spent on Betty over the next year. A crib, money for food and clothing. She sent it all to Heartsease. And Library of Congress. I spent a year hanging out there. I went through records of many more shelters and homes throughout the United States. Many worked toward prevention of unmarried pregnancy by providing group lodgings and affiliations for young women who, once again, they would otherwise be alone and vulnerable. And just some of the names: the National League on Urban Conditions Among Negroes, the Association for Befriending Children and Young Girls, the Free Home for Young Girls, the New Shelter for Young Women. Charles Crittenden, known as the millionaire evangelist, founded in 1883 the first rescue home of the chain that would become the National Florence Crittenden Mission, named after his daughter, Florence. Her death plunged him into despair until he became a Christian. The number of Crittenden homes grew to 65 by 1927. They helped 500,000 unmarried girls and women. Some of these homes were integrated. Some of them, unfortunately, were segregated. But all of them, Crittenden homes and others, helped lots of people, thousands of people to become Christians and helped thousands of babies to be born. The Salvation Army in 1900 had 34 homes for unmarried mothers. The Door of Hope group had 40 homes, built, I'm quoting here, in hopes of not simply sheltering and furnishing them with employment, but through love and sympathy to lead them to a Christian life. The Women's Christian Temperance Union's Department of Rescue Work had at least 5 shelters. And by the way, that group, the WCTU, was the largest women's organization in the United States in the late 1800s. The Episcopal Church had 12 homes of mercy. The Jewish Lakeview Home provided industrial training and personal counseling for 25 women, each with a baby. And I learned something about some of these babies and their moms. I learned about Delenia and Delilah at shelters in Jacksonville and Montgomery, Alabama. Delenia, a minister's daughter, was 5 months pregnant. She stayed in a refuge. She gave birth. She became a nurse. Delilah was a 16-year-old orphan. She eloped with a young man. His car supposedly broke down on the way to the county courthouse. While they waited for the car to be repaired, she agreed to show him her love. He then abandoned her. Delilah gave birth and placed her son for adoption. And there's a lot of sadness in these stories. Some things went wrong, of course. Some children ended up abandoned. Christians in many large cities in the late 19th century worked on placements for foster care and adoption. The model for many of them was the New York Children's Aid Society. A fellow named Charles Brace founded it, and he ran it for about 4 decades. And Brace believed, quoting here, the child most of all needs individual care and sympathy. In an asylum, he is letter B of class 3 or number 2 of cell 426. So he tried to get those kids into families as quickly as possible. He wrote, as Christian men, we cannot look upon this great multitude of unhappy, deserted, and degraded boys and girls without feeling our responsibility to God for them. We bear in mind that one died for them, even as for the children of the rich and happy. Brace's Children's Aid Society in the late 19th century successfully placed close to 4,000 children each year. One boy described his experience after he was sent to a farm in Indiana, where care was taken that I should be occupied there and not in town. In sickness, I was ever cared for by prompt attention. In winter, I was sent to the public school. And again, I'm not saying all these stories were happy. No one could abolish sin. The Children's Aid Society interviewed in a few abusive situations, but mostly their investigators reported, wherever we went, we found the children sitting at the same table with the families, going to the school with the children, in every way treated as well as any other children. Some whom we had seen once in the most extreme misery, we beheld seated, clothed, and clean. Now, what about the women who did have abortions? Some abortion advocates now say, hey, you pro-lifers, you talk about post-abortion syndrome. That doesn't exist, you're making it up. But I read a book published in 1875, The Abuse of Maternity by Elizabeth Evans. Evans interviewed women who had had abortions years before and were still miserable. One said she was wild with regret at my folly in rejecting the gift of offspring. It was the only time she got pregnant. Another said the memory of abortion deprived her of whatever degree of pride or satisfaction I might otherwise feel in the more praiseworthy deeds of my career. You can read many, many more moving statements in that book, Elizabeth Evans, The Abuse of Maternity, 1875. And by the way, I should mention my wife, whose name is Susan, doesn't mind when I'm full of admiration for Helen Mercy Woods of the Erring Women's Refuge, or Annie Richardson Kennedy, or Elizabeth Evans, because they've all been dead for a long time. But here's what's wonderful. Some people involved with or watching this Gospel Life rally are heroes whom some historian will be admiring a century from now. So what can we learn from the past? How can we apply that history to the present? What's different about life 100 to 150 years ago and life today? What's similar? What's different is that back then, a double standard existed. Respectable men could be sexually loose, visiting brothels, paying prostitutes. Respectable women could not be. And you can sense what's different from the names of those institutions I mentioned. The Erring Women's Refuge, the Heartsease Home. Women who got pregnant and wanted to return to polite society would often disappear secretly once they were maybe 4 months pregnant. And they'd come back half a year later, having purportedly visited relatives or toured Europe, and they placed their kids for adoption. Today, the double standard has largely disappeared. And that sounds like a good thing, but in practice it means that everyone's standard is lower. Ever since the 1960s, most young people, men and women, have seen chastity as weird. When you're an adult, you commit adultery. And contraception doesn't always contracept, which means the more sexual activity among unmarried people, the more a crisis pregnancy at some point is likely. What can we do about that? Not much by natural means. We have the most aggressive youth culture in the history of the world. The propaganda is everywhere, including inside our homes, coming through our computers, tablets, smartphones. I'm 71 now, but I can remember my life as a teenager and in my early 20s. The pressure was much less then. It was just James Bond movies and other cinematic celebrations of adultery, or Playboy magazines behind a drugstore counter with the cover hidden. It's much harder for kids now. We can say be abstinent. We can show them what the Bible says, but Satan's bait and switch is constant. The bait is obvious: physical pleasure, a sense of psychological conquest. The switch becomes evident over time when young bodies become old and loneliness swamps lust. The ABCs of alienation, brokenness, confusion, they take their toll. Yet by the time reality sinks in at age 40 or 50 or so, decades are gone, they cannot be replaced. So many of you know about this. I do have a solution to offer. My hobby 15 to 30 years ago was interviewing Major League Baseball players and coaches for World, the magazine that I've had the pleasure and satisfaction of editing for 29 years now. Ray Miller in 1993 was the pitching coach of the Pittsburgh Pirates. He told me how he defined his job: putting old heads on young bodies. And that's the job of pro-life people. That's my partial solution. I suspect you're asking, that's a solution? Old heads on young bodies? How do you do that? Well, you don't do it by giving stern lectures. You don't do it, except for a few people, by having students read Plato, Aristotle, Stoic philosophers. Some young people learn by personal experience of heartbreak and broken promises. Others learn by stories about not getting satisfaction by being promiscuous. Gritty stories of how people change. True stories about the satisfaction long marriages and children can bring. Now, World Magazine, we're We ran stories for a couple of years about the marriages that have been 40 or more years. The stories were realistic about the pressures couples faced at times. But they were also optimistic about showing how the couples were able to work through problems and come out stronger. But the most important stories are not lived out by people you don't know, they're lived out by parents. Our kids are more likely to resist the bait if we don't snap at it ourselves. Others, even in our churches, very often we do. We do snap at it. When we have adultery, divorce in our churches, how can we teach convincingly about fidelity? If we're not pushing hard for sexual fidelity among people in their 30s and 40s and 50s, we should not be pushing for it among teenagers with raging hormones. So what happens if the stories don't work? And they often do not. The only good answer I have here is the Christian one. Maybe a few people can walk around our modern Babylon without succumbing to all the pressures. But for most people, the road only goes in one direction. You head towards sin, or you must be born again. That's my own experience. It's also the experience of every ex-addict I know. So many people. You must be born again. Often people want to change because God has changed them. So we need churches that host and facilitate that maybe host and facilitate accountability groups for young men. In the 1990s, I interviewed not only pitching coaches, but many Christian major leaguers. When I asked them to name the biggest obstacle to their Christian walk, especially when they're traveling with their team, they almost always specified sexual temptation. Good-looking women giving them come-hither looks and hotel room keys. You know what to do? And a lot of these players, urged on by pastors, formed accountability groups or accountability partners. So they would just be in the field, they would not play the field. And one way to cut down on abortions is for non-athletes to go and do likewise, to be going to church, be confessing to others, be talking with them about the temptations by trying to do the hard thing of turning down sexual opportunities that are just rampant in our society today. Real hard, but it needs to be done, and churches and pastors can help a lot. Again, we need to put old heads in young bodies. But it's particularly hard to hit a fastball if you haven't had any batting practice. That's why pregnancy help is often inadequate if there hasn't been pre-pregnancy help. I'll start with a couple of stories, including one published 45 years ago. The author was Linda Bird Franke, who used the pseudonym Jane Doe to write in the New York Times about her abortion experience. She wrote about how there just wasn't room in her life for the child growing within her. She found herself at a clinic waiting for an abortion, and she writes, "I began to panic. Suddenly the rhetoric, the abortion marches that I'd walked in, they all peeled away, and I was all alone with my microscopic baby." And Frankie went through with the abortion. She thought there was no room in her life for a dot that would grow and emerge with tenderness but also tears. Later she realized that, of course, she could have made room. Here's what she wrote. "I have this ghost now, a very little ghost that only appears when I'm seeing something beautiful, like the full moon on the ocean last weekend. And the baby waves at me, and I wave at the baby." The New York Times published that column. I'm not sure it would now, with abortion orthodoxy ruling all the most influential publications. I remember, but can't put my hands on another column from the 1970s. As I recall, there was a journalist in a cab in New York City. He looks up and he sees the building where his girlfriend had an abortion years before. He realizes now that the baby, if born, would now be in her 20s. He knows he has lost out, and the aborted child has lost even more. He says, in essence, like Linda Bird Franke, "Oh, I wish I had had on my young body the old head I have now. I could have made room. There was room." Putting an old head on a young body means thinking more broadly than I suppose, the binary choice. abortion or single parenting. Thinking more broadly now is different from what it was a century ago. A century ago, some single women had abortions because they felt desperate. Their baby bumps would tell the whole world they had not been chaste. They feared people around them would be looking and thinking and sometimes saying, "Unclean, unclean." They needed to hear real stories about other single women who had given birth and had not suffered ruin. They needed to learn they could still have good marriages. Now, in the 21st century, we need a different type of reimagining. It's great to give pregnant moms diapers and material help, but that doesn't get at the major work before us. A declaration last month by 500 female athletes shows today's fear. They said that if women don't have access to abortion, quote, the consequences for women's athletics and for society as a whole would be devastating. One swimming champion described her situation 3 decades ago. "I was just starting to succeed in my sport. I didn't want to take a year off. I decided to have an abortion. Then I could start training really hard, and that summer I won my first national championship." I don't minimize that at all. A national championship is a great thing, but that champion's child would now be about 30 years old. Now, it seems to me that a living daughter and maybe grandchildren by now is better than a medal in a cabinet. But again, you're young and athletic, your talent has a sell-by date, I can understand that. I can imagine the pressure of not losing a year, unless you believe that God is sovereign over life, death, and championships. For others, I'm not sure the pressure is that great. In a business career and something else, yeah, you can lose some months, you can lose half a year, you can lose 9 months, and you can still go on. But that's hard sometimes for young people to know because they don't have old heads and young bodies. So we need to tell stories of women who choose not to abort, women who don't have old heads on young bodies. We need to be able to show that, yes, you can still have a productive career. Maybe it's delayed, but hey, these days life is long. You have many decades. Don't just be propelled by the heat you feel at the moment. Putting an old head on a young body is more doable for those who understand that God gives us different seasons in our lives. But it's hard. It's hard in a society when we idolize careers and material success. But maybe, with help from churches and pro-life people, maybe others can learn patience as well. So, yeah, go beyond. We need to go beyond the binary choice of abortion or single parenting. Because some women think of single parenting as an 18-year or more prison sentence. The Crisis Pregnancy Center that my wife founded in Austin, way back in 1984, helped a young woman whose story is typical up to a point. She was pregnant. Her boyfriend and angry parents did not show compassion. She felt all alone, but she did not want to abort her child. So she lived at our house for 9 months. It was hard. Sometimes she cried in her room, but she persevered. And then, after the delivery, the boyfriend finally showed up. He fell in love with the baby, and then fell in love with her all over again. They married, stayed together, had 2 more children. That happens. Not all the time, not most of the time, but it happens. And we have to tell stories about how it can happen. And then we can put old heads on young bodies by making adoption a major choice again. More than 2/3 of the babies born between 1880 and 1907 at a refuge in Elmira, New York, were placed for adoption. And since Roe v. Wade, propagandists have written lots and lots of anti-adoption stories. I've read lots of them, and I can see that one reason, every happily adopted child cuts against the legend that abortion is necessary. That's one reason. Here's a second. The bad news of an adoption gone wrong, and that happens sometimes, is a harder take than the more numerous stories of successful placements. So next month, November, National Adoption Month. Adoption is hard, but it's good. I know that from personal experience and from the experience of others. We should be on the lookout for good, realistic stories to tell, and maybe some of you can tell them. Both marriage and adoption have become rare choices. Since Roe v. Wade in 1973, we've made abortion all through pregnancy not only legal, but in certain circles, expected. The choice is in the hands of the woman, and that means the responsibility is also hers. A man who's made a woman pregnant can say, I don't want to be a father, although at that point he already is. Roland Warren is the CareNet, Roland Warren is the CEO of CareNet, the biggest umbrella group for crisis pregnancy centers. He talks about the importance of the father's involvement. He said, we focus on saving the baby and helping the mother, love them both, but that misses something. We should say, love them all, because of the impact on the abortion decision of the guy who got her pregnant. For too long in the pro-life movement, we haven't focused on engaging him and inspiring him to be involved. And Roland Warren and his wife-to-be were in college when he made her pregnant. These days, guys tend to respond to the news of a girlfriend's pregnancy in three ways. One is the get lost response. How do I know it's mine? The second is purportedly an acceptance of responsibility. Okay, I'll pay for an abortion. And the third, considered optimal by some feminists, is I'll support whatever decision you make. But Warren says that's a guy's non-response response, a shift of the moral and social responsibility to her with an attempt to make it look like you're supportive. CareNet's research shows that in many of those situations, women are hoping he'll say, I'll be your husband and a father to our child. We can do this. We can do this. That should be a motto for the pro-life movement. We, fathers, mothers, with help from others. You may have heard the story about a man who drove his car into a ditch in a desolated area. Local rancher comes to help with his big, strong horse named Buddy. He hitches Buddy up to the car and he yells, pull, Nellie, pull. And Buddy doesn't move. Then the rancher hollers, pull, Buster, pull. And Buster doesn't respond. And once more, the rancher commands, pull, Pokey, pull. And nothing happens. And then the rancher nonchalantly says, pull, Buddy, pull. And the horse easily drags the car out of the ditch. The motorist is thankful and curious. He asks the rancher, why'd you call your horse by the wrong name 3 times? And the rancher says, oh, Buddy is blind, and if he thought he was the only one pulling, he wouldn't even try. So a lot of women feel they're the only one pulling. They need to try, but they need help. During and after a crisis pregnancy, mothers and fathers need a supportive community. We in the pro-life movement need to be supportive physically and spiritually. The good news of Christ is the primary motivator for many of us. But we now have a secondary support, science. Every time you see one of those yard signs, science is real, or I believe in science, it's a reminder to us, and I hope to other people, that unborn children are real. And we can now see that reality. We in the pro-life movement have a really hard task, but we have a big advantage over our predecessors, ultrasound pictures. Dr. Stephen Tracy wrote in 1853, at 45 days, the head is very large, the eyes, mouth, and nose are to be distinguished. At 2 months, all the parts of the child are present. The fingers and toes are distinct. At 3 months, the heart pulsates strongly. Well, what Tracy described in the book, words, we can now see. We can see that through ultrasound. We can see the fingers, toes, the heart of an unborn child early in pregnancy. Whittaker Chambers, 50-some years ago, no more than that, almost 70 years ago, wrote a great book, Witness. He writes about how he moved from communism to Christ. There's a key moment when he watches his newborn daughter. He wrote, my eye came to rest on the delicate convolutions of her ear, those intricate, perfect ears. The thought passed through my mind. No, those ears were not created by any chance coming together of atoms in nature, the communist view. They could have been created only by immense design. And now, thanks be to God, a young woman or man leaning toward abortion can look at their unborn child, see his intricate fingers and toes, see her beating heart, those pictures are worth thousands of my words, or anyone's. So it's time to stop. I'll conclude with what Captain Virgil Hiltz, Steve McQueen's character, tells the prisoner of war camp commandant. I haven't seen Berlin yet, from the ground or from the air, and I plan on doing both before the war is over. So, we want mothers and fathers, as they visit a pro-life center, to say with joy, we haven't seen our child yet on an ultrasound or in the flesh, and we plan on doing both. Thank you very much.
The U.S. accounts for only 3% of the abortions that happen in our world each year, leaving 97% of the crisis before us as a world missions challenge. Would you join us in serving where the need is greatest? Passion Life, rescuing the most vulnerable where abortion is most concentrated.
Closed countries and unreached people groups are the final frontier of global missions. 1/3 of humanity have still never heard the name of Jesus. 42% of the world's population live in closed countries with little or no gospel witness. And for every 30 missionaries that go to the reached, roughly 1 missionary goes to unreached people groups.
God's heart breaks for the nations. He longs to redeem a people from every tribe and nation on the earth. We believe God is calling a generation to go to closed countries and to unreached peoples. We've started the Open Initiative to help them get there. Find out how you can help open a closed country at abwe.org.
Marvin and Olasky, thank you so much for joining us here at the Gospel Life Rally and for preparing such insightful and historically rich statements and comments. Thanks for your research and for your comments.
Oh, it's a privilege to be with you.
Yeah. Really appreciate the work the World Magazine does in the Christian world, in the realm of influencing Christian leaders and thinkers and even pew sitters, and you are so consistent on the issue of abortion and talking about it with a critical thinking, clear leadership, and I just really appreciate that.
Well, good, thank you.
Yeah. So a lot of the comments that you made as you have dug through historical records and sat in the Library of Congress and seen the rich history of what Christians have done to help women in crisis and families in crisis over the years, much of it I'm completely blown away by. I've never heard it. I'm sure there are plenty of folks at home who've not been exposed to this rich history, and it's something that we need to grab hold of. It's something we need to understand. Have you recorded any of this in book form? Are we getting kind of a first taste here in the Gospel Life Rally?
Well, sure. In book form, a long time ago I wrote 2 books, one in 1988 called The Press and Abortion, which looked at newspaper coverage of abortion from 1838 through 1988, and showed, for example, that the New York Times, which is strongly pro-abortion now, was actually very pro-life in the 1860s, the 1870s, and so forth, and telling that story. And then in 1992, I spent a year in the Library of Congress going through records there and wrote a book called Abortion Rights, R-I-T-E-S, A Social History of Abortion in America. And both of those books are now available for free at the World website. You just go to WNG for World News Group, WNG.org, and you go on the landing page, you go down to the bottom, you'll see Marvin, Olasky, you press on that, and those books are just there for people to read and download. So that was then, and this is now, 30 years later, coming back to the subject. And I have a short book that came out early this year called Abortion at the Crossroads, which goes through the three tunnels, that analogy from the Great Escape. And so that, in a way, was my spring training. But it's out there now in brief. And then the major project is a full-scale history of abortion that I'm working on right now, and will come out in January 2023, God willing. And my hope is by then perhaps the Supreme Court will have gotten rid of Roe v. Wade. But the 50th anniversary, sad anniversary, is January 2023, and so the book will be there to tell people the true history of what went on.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I look forward to seeing that, and I'm sure there's a lot more information now than there was in 1988 to dig through.
Oh, it's huge. And
in 92.
Yeah, and I've learned a lot more, and I've learned some of the stories of some of the characters that I knew superficially in a two-dimensional way, and now it's really fascinating to find their three-dimensionality. You talk about the comments that you made to us here in the rally, you talk about the importance of story and the place that story plays in the Christian worldview. We might consider that testimony of what God has done in the lives of some of these people over the years. Such rich, wonderful stories. Yeah. Oh, just amazing stories of huge diligence, of people fighting huge odds, having it easier than us in some ways, having it harder than us in other ways, but persevering. So yeah, these are heroes, and I mentioned during my talk, and I'm serious about this, that people are doing stuff today that historians 100 years from now will report on and pay attention to.
Exactly.
And our major audience, our number one audience, the only real important audience is God.
Yes.
But the angels are watching also. We see that in several places in the Bible. And then it's kind of fun to think about that perhaps the stuff we're doing today, as we trudge through, and it may seem mundane and repetitive, but it's historic. And yeah.
Yeah, I was writing down even some of the names of these societies: the Free Home for Young Girls, the Episcopals, the Homes of Mercy that the Episcopal Church had, the New York Children's Aid Society, the Erring Women's Refuge. Are there parallels today besides these? Obviously, the major mechanism, the effective model right now for a lot of these kinds of ministries is the Pregnancy Help Center. Are there other centers, agencies that are doing similar work to what some of these social welfare Christian agencies were doing in those times?
Yeah, the pregnancy help centers are hugely important. And a big difference between now and back then is that women don't feel the need to have to go away and hide, and so they're right where they are. You can be ministering to people, and they can be going about their daily lives, but they can also come and get guidance and help, both material and spiritual. So that's huge.
It is huge. Obviously, you know that one of the big accusations that the pro-choice side levels against pro-life advocates is that we don't care about these babies after they are born. And your comments highlight that has never been true. Working in the pro-life industry in the capacity that I do now, I see that it is not true currently. Compiling these evidences really is super important, because we have a rich and glorious history as Christians that we should not back down on. We should be able to stand up and say, look at these agencies.
Yeah, very true. I really owe to my wife all this time in research on abortion, because she's the one who really got me into this. She had been a volunteer counselor at a pregnancy center in Delaware, and then when we moved to Austin, Texas, there wasn't anything there, and so she started the Austin Crisis Pregnancy Center in 1984.
Okay, 84.
And that's what really got me involved in this. As she was doing it right now, I started delving back in my job as a professor at the University of Texas.
Right.
Started going back into the history, And I should mention one other book that she and I wrote together called More Than Kindness, A Compassionate Approach to Crisis Childbearing. And I believe that's also available for free on the World website.
Okay.
And that looks at adoption and how important that is. So, yeah, the heroines really, some heroes, but mostly women who start, found, and work and volunteer at crisis pregnancy centers just have to persevere.
That's right.
With lots of discipline, but also times when they really save lives of babies and help to change the lives of the women.
You brought up adoption again, and I had not considered the things that you mentioned in your talk about the fact that the whole idea of adoption really has been slandered in some ways, specifically to serve the purposes of the pro-choice argument that abortion is better than adoption. Can you talk a little bit more about how and why they've done that?
Well, why? Every happy child, every happy adopted child is an indictment of the abortionist.
That's right.
This child, this child is doing well, and this child, you could have killed this child, but you didn't. Right. And now look what happened.
The child's happy, the family is happy.
Yeah, so abortionists and pro-abortion people don't want that story to be around.
Right.
There may be, and also just as journalistically in a way, the bad story is more engaging or more headline causing than the good story.
Everybody loves some good bad news.
Yeah, bad news leads basically.
Yeah, it does.
So there's that aspect of it too, but that's not good journalism. It's not realistic journalism. It's not honest journalism. So we have to go out and tell those stories, not in a way that says everyone always lives happily at every moment forever, but realistically. My wife and I have 3 children born to us, and we adopted our 4th. And it's been good for him and great for us. Just sort of seeing the way he's been able to grow and develop, and he could have been killed.
Yeah, it's not easy to adopt, and foster care obviously is another way. Are there other ways that Christians can, as Christians are thinking about ways that they can engage in the pro-life movement, the things that come to mind immediately are, I can go down to the local Planned Parenthood and I can pray and I can counsel women, but there are so many more ways that people can get involved, like foster care. I mean, that's directly serving a place of need in the pro-life world.
Oh, sure, and you see in the flesh the usefulness of what you're doing. I mean, my wife and I took care of a couple of children ages 6 and 9 for about 6 months, and then worked to have those children adopted, and think their lives have been really good since then. I'm sure difficulties, but good. Yeah. And they came to us and they had never had anyone reading them a bedtime story. This was all foreign behavior to them. They hadn't been in a situation where people would actually sit around a table and eat dinner together and talk.
Right.
The 6-year-old knew about different types of cigarettes, marijuana, cigarettes, this, but didn't know about other stuff. And you can just see the changes even in that short time. So it's enormously rewarding to the parents doing foster care, but even much more rewarding to the children and seeing their lives change in that way. So, yeah, this is when pro-life people do that. It is just huge, hard, but just enormously rewarding.
Enormously rewarding for the child and for the family,
right,
and for the community that the child is growing up in. I think about the fact that Christians really conceived the ideas of orphanages, hospitals, universities, the Underground Railroad, the Red Cross. Everywhere you look where there's elderly care or care for the addicted or care for the mentally afflicted, Christians are often right at the tip of the spear there. Which again, as Christians, I think it's so important for us to think about these things. Think about these things when someone comes to us and accuses us of saying, well, you only care about this baby when it's a fetus in the womb. But you can look at the rich and glorious history that Christianity has to the glory of God.
And No, it's a history.
serving.
It's a history that shows how Christians have helped the least among these, the most needy among us, and that also is the best type of evangelism. Really, when Christians show it and do it. You know, going back 2,000 years ago in ancient Rome, you know, the pagans put out their kids they didn't want for exposure, for them to die of hunger and cold and so forth.
Right.
And the Christians not only did not do that, but they went and picked up those kids.
That's right.
And that was huge, obviously, for those kids, but it was also that's what led in God's providence to the expansion of Christianity.
You mentioned that, and it's so important that these acts of service, these ways that we can come into the lives of people in pregnancy crisis, so often lead to an opportunity for people to not only hear the gospel, but to respond to the gospel and to live in the glory of the gospel as regenerate people. This is the Gospel Life Rally, and our focus in this is to find the nexus, the crossroads of where the gospel and pro-life work meet.
Yeah.
And you've given us great stories of how oftentimes people who come into these agencies that we're serving, women in crisis, they often found the community of faith and faith in Christ that way.
Yeah, and if people want more of those stories, every week in World, we have a newsletter that goes out to anyone. Anyone can sign up for free.
Okay.
That covers the life stories of the past week. And if people go to the website, they can see. We call them roundups.
Yeah.
And people can see the roundups and just sign up for it. And each week in their email, they'll receive stories and information that will be useful to them as they want to go with pro-life activities.
I hope people will do that. Passion Life, as you know, sees the need for more pro-life work in overseas countries where the abortion rate is even higher than the abortion rate in the United States. Sometimes I ask people what percentage of the worldwide abortion problem is in the United States. Of all the abortions that take place in the world every year, what percentage of those happen in the United States? Some people realize what the number is, but I often hear people say, I don't know, 70%, 60%. And the answer is that it's about 3% of the world's abortions happen in the United States. It's too many. But Passion Life goes all over the world to places where abortion rates are high and the amount of pregnancy help is low. And we, like you, are collecting stories of not only opportunities for people to have Christians come into their lives and serve them in their pregnancy crisis to help save the baby, but so often these women open their hearts to a faith relationship and meet Jesus Christ through these Christians.
Yeah, no, this is great work, and John Ensor is one of my heroes. So, and then, you know, there are so many people who are heroes, and they just keep doing it anonymously. And they just do it for God's glory and for the sake of the children. So, yeah, this is the best testimony to the reality of Christ and how He changes lives. Amen.
Well, let's leave it there as people at home consider whether or not they might be used of God to be looked back on by historians 100 years from now as those who really changed the world by serving Christ and serving people in crisis.
Amen.
Thank you for your insights and for your time.
Well, thank you.